Last week, Sean kicked off the beginning of a series. We're doing basically a 5-week series working up to basically Stewardship Sunday, a time where we make our commitments to the church and to God about giving to the church. And what we wanted to do was really talk about the church and why the church, why is it important to be here and what this church stands for. What is our mission here at the church? And, as Sean spoke last week, he talked about, why church is important. And how that links up with our mission. And one of the things he was talking about was the fact that a lot of our lives are separated from one another, from different things. We have things segregated and separated, and over time we always see that. And yet the church is a place that calls us into unity. It's a place that calls us together. And it's kind of that revelation, or that reality that we are called to be unified, that those barriers are being broken down, and ultimately they will be completely broken down when we're all reunited in the kingdom. All those divisions will be separated. And this morning, I want to continue kind of in that path and talk about, we talked about the church. Why the church? Because that's a place where we're called to be unified. Well, why a church family? Yeah, we're here, but why are we called to be connected to one another? Why is it important for us to be here and to know one another? To actually be in a relationship with one another. Why are those things that are important to us? Why are they important to God? And this morning, that's where I just want us to continue this conversation when we're thinking about us as a church, us as someone who's trying to live out our mission here on earth, and us as someone who is looking about how do we ultimately invest back into this family? How do all these things play out so that we invest back into it, so that in 5 weeks, all these pieces start coming together and we start to go, okay, that's why I'm here. And that's why this place is important. And that's why I want to connect both my life, energy, and service to the church, but also my funding. It's all kind of built up because it's this idea that where we are is important because God laid this out for us. And we need to be reminded of that sometimes because it's easy to be separated in our own little place. When Gabe was born, up until that point, family to me was kind of separate. It was kind of like, okay, I have my family. They're, some in Wheeling, some in South Carolina. They're kind of scattered. Plus, his family's starting to scatter too. We're kind of ending up all over the place on the East Coast. And you start to realize at some point that you can keep going that way, and you can kind of keep being disconnected. And everyone can kind of be in their own little pocket of place. But as Gabe came along, I started realizing that there's an importance to this. There's an importance to being connected to our families. There's an importance to him getting to know his grandparents, his great-grandparents. That all that plays into his development. That ultimately he will be a better person if he knows them. And he will be more fulfilled if he knows his family because he will know his history. He'll know his past. He will understand and know that there's this unconditional love that lies in his family for him. And that's an important place for him. And it's something that I've taken for granted over the years. It's like, oh, my family's back there. But as I've watched my grandparents, his great-grandparents get older, we've become more aware and more focused on that. And, he lost one of his great-grandparents this past summer. But I'm so grateful that even in this short time of his life, we were able to take the time to make sure we got over and visited, and take time for him to meet her, and to have pictures, and to be able to tell the story as he gets older of who she was, and how important it is for him to know that. And those are all the things that I'm kind of being retaught as I get older, because I'm seeing my family kind of move away to different places, and I'm seeing the importance that Gabe gets connected to him. And I think for our church family, it's important to understand that that has a very similar meaning to it. That we have this ability that God has laid out for us to have a very similar kind of understanding of what our church family is about, because ultimately it's the place where God has put us and placed us on earth and connects us because of our spirit, because of what we believe, that gives us that ability to know our history, our past, to know the people around us, to find that support, to find that unconditional love. Our church family works very similar to our biological or natural families. They are to do the same thing. But I will say this also, they are both difficult at times. They're both a challenge because it's easy to take both of them for granted or put ourselves in a place where we want what is kind of our own agenda to work out. And so this morning I want to just look into Paul's words a little bit. We were in Ephesians last week in chapter 2. We're going to stay in Ephesians in chapter 4 and just take a look at Paul's words for the church. He's calling them to be unified. He's calling them to be connected. And he wants them to understand why it is important and understand what it is in that family, in that unity that keeps them connected. So let's look at Ephesians 4. It starts in verse 1. Therefore, the prisoner in the Lord, beg you to lead a life worthy of the calling to which you've been called, with all humility, gentleness, and patience, bearing with one another in love, making every effort to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to one hope of your calling. One Lord, one faith, one baptism. One God and Father of all, who is above all and through all and in all. Paul's desire is to make sure that this church is unified. The letters to the churches were not written to individuals. They were written to a congregation or a group of people, and they were to be read publicly so they could hear these things. And so many times when we read them and hear them, we're thinking individually, we're thinking, okay, this is for us to really wrestle with. But we have to keep in mind that his purpose of this letter was for the whole body, for this whole church of Ephesus. They hear this to be reminded that they are to be unified. And what he does, and I love this because I function like this, is he is trying to pull them back to understand why. Why is this important? Why is this significant? Why do you need to understand that this is something that you need to continue to work on? And he does that by pointing them to the fact that they have this calling, that they are called to live something that is worthy, that they have this thing on them because of the life that God has called them to. As individuals and as a body, he wants them to understand what that is. So he's basically setting this picture up for them to see how they are unified. So he starts using all these words to make them understand what it is at their core that unifies them. So he uses the idea of they're one body. He's referring to them as a church, as a group of believers. There's one Spirit, that they are connected by the Spirit of God. It unifies them, it pulls them together. There is one hope. They have this hope in God and in Jesus Christ, that at some point God's going to pull all this stuff back together. Jesus said that, I'm going to come back. And at that point, everything will start to come back together. They have this hope in an everlasting, eternal God, this kingdom that is to take place. One Lord. They have a common understanding of who Jesus Christ is and what Christ did for them. One faith. They're connected around that belief on who Jesus was and who Jesus is. One baptism. We talk about baptisms here. That they are united around this idea that this sacrament or this belief that they have died to their old past, they've died to their sins, that they've been renewed in Christ. They have this one baptism that they are all unified around. And finally, one God the Father who is over all, through all, and in all. He is pointing them back to this unified spirit, this unified understanding, this unified belief. And for us, as we read this, it is a call for us to be reminded about what we believe. Our church many times uses the Apostles' Creed. It's a creed that starts off, I believe in God the Father, Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and Jesus Christ, his only Son. And it continues on. And the reason we do that and continue to say that is because it's words that bring us back. It's those words that bring us back to what we hold dear and what we believe. It unifies us. It puts us there together and says, these are the things that are core. These are the center things that are a part of you. These are the things that you can't walk away from because this is what God has instilled in us. These are the things that we can't say, I like it, but but I'm not connected to him, because we are connected. We're connected in our faith. We're connected in our spirit. We're connected because of what we believe. And he lays this foundation out in Ephesians so they hear it, so they're reminded of it. And for us, it's important because as things get difficult and things are challenging for us in our lives and in our faith, we need a place to stabilize. We need something at the core that stabilizes us. And for our church family, it's around these beliefs. You know, in many ways, for our natural family or our biological families, we have a core that we know we can't separate them because we're connected by blood or history. We know we can't walk away. No matter what we do, we always have it. We might be miles and miles apart, but we know whether we like it or not, we're connected. And it's part of who we are. The church, our church family, it is this core of beliefs. It's this core of understanding. It's this core of one spirit unified into one body that connects us. And we can't separate from it. So we need to embrace it and be remembered and remember it. And when we understand that, then we start to ask that question, okay, so if that is what unifies us, then how are we to relate to one another? How are we to connect with one another? And Paul continues on by using these words to help the community understand this is what this looks like. You're unified in spirit, but you're also unified in the way that you relate to one another. And he uses these words. He talks about bearing with one another in love. That we are to be connected in love. That when we are in a family, when we are connected with family, we love one another. And that means sacrifice sometimes. That's tough. Sometimes it's hard. But that's what we're being called to do. We are being called to love one another, to bear with one another. I love that idea that we are bearing with one another. That as members of a church family, we walk with one another in our struggles. We carry one another. We bear with one another. And that means that we need to be reminded that, you know, when we walk in here, it's not about us. It's not just about us walking through the door, but it's about us coming in and connecting, bearing, and walking with one another. And we should do this in humility. It says to be completely humble. To set our pride aside. Set that aside for a little bit and be humble with one another and really care for one another. And not worry about our own agenda, but to be humble in our spirit and to care for one another. And we are to be meek and gentle. Again, you start getting this image of that it's not about me walking through the door and getting my needs fulfilled, but it's about me walking through the door and caring about one another and setting those aside and being humble and being meek or gentle and walking with one another. And we should be patient with one another. These are all the words I've used in this scripture of trying to communicate what this church family looks like. Finally, he says it should be all bound together by peace. That peace should pull these things together. My family, my personal family, we've had our drama over the years. We have our struggles over the years. And we're always trying to get back to that baseline, that peacefulness. You know, we're trying to figure it out as family members have had conflicts with one another, or we've watched one of us go through a divorce or whatever else. We're trying to find that bond of peace so that we can support one another. As a church, we know what it's like to work and be beside one another. We have tensions that go up and down. You know, like any relationships, they're a struggle. But the idea here is that as we walk through the doors and we set our own agendas down, we come in with love, humility, and gentleness, and patience. Our goal is to find peace and to continue to lift one another and be unified with one another. And our hope is that as we do that, we become better people for it, better in our faith, that God's love that's in us starts to be reflected to others. Paul's desire here for the church is to unify them and to give them a framework of how they are to relate to one another. And I think for us, we're always looking for those same things. Why are we together? And how do we relate to one another? And we need to be reminded that sometimes it's difficult. But if we work through it and we're willing to lay our own agendas aside and put these things into place, we will be better for them, and we'll start to understand exactly who God has created us to be and how God has really formed us as a body to really care for one another and reach out for one another. When Gabe was born, and our family doesn't live here, so we understood that, you know, we were kind kind of alone here. At least, that was kind of what was going through our minds. What we found was over that week and the next couple of weeks was the church responded to us in a way we had never experienced before. This church came to our house. They delivered meals. They stopped by. They came in to see how we were doing, if we needed anything else. And it was, as soon as you thought, oh, this can't happen again, they were at the door again. And as soon as you thought, oh, I forgot to do a meal, they showed up. You all showed up with a meal. And it was a reflection of that love that bears with one another, that we got to experience, that reminded us, this is what God's desire is, for us to be connected, for us to be unified in spirit and in love and bonded together in peace, because that's his desire for the church, for us. And so I think that as we ask this question, why a church family? It's because it's what God created for us. It is the unit that God has put together to unify us together, to know that we have someone that will walk with us, someone that will bear with us, our struggles. It is the unit that God has put together so that we can learn and understand who we truly have been created to be, knowing that we have friends around us to support us to do that. And when things get tough and we have struggles, we have a group that is there, walking with us, carrying us, and helping us to get to the next step. And our desire here at the church, and I want to read this so I make sure that I say this correctly. Our hope at the church is this: that we want to make this church a caring community where each person is able to feel God's love, or feel the love of God being shared with one another. The leadership of the church, this is the desire, and I'll read over time. To have a caring church, or to make this a caring church community where each person is able to feel the love of God being shared with one another. That's why we're called to be a church family. So that we have a caring community that can bear with one another and feel the love and share that with one another. And that's our hope as we are looking at the church over the next couple of weeks. God's call for this church over the next couple of weeks. We start to understand how all those pieces come together so that we can reflect on this and think about what is our place in this church? Where has God called us and how do we serve you? Whether it's through our time and effort or whether it's through our finances. But our hope is that we understand the pool of what God has placed for us.